Hello, my name is Lucy Alvarado, and my project focuses on the topic of Christian denominations in the stress process. In particular, I'll be focusing on answering the question of how intrinsic religiosity shapes coping strategies and interpretation of life stressors differently among evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics. For some context, even though Roman Catholics and Protestants fall under the umbrella of Christianity, they have a lot of intergroup differences. For instance, they believe that salvation is attained in different ways. Roman Catholics believe that salvation is attained through faith and good works, versus Protestants believe that salvation is attained through faith. They also have different sources of authority. For Protestants, Scripture is the source of authority alone, versus for Roman Catholics, scriptures and church traditions are sources of authority, so they're more likely to prioritize going to church, versus Protestants really emphasize the importance of private prayer. For some backgrounds, in this study, I define religiosity as the degree to which religion is regarded as central to one's life. I focus on one type of religious orientation, and that is intrinsic religiosity. This is when all needs are subordinated to an overarching religious commitment, as Allenport states. In other words, for those with intrinsic religiosity, they are more likely to see religion as a primary motivator in life, and they use religion as a central framework in how they go about their positioning in the world and their purpose. I hypothesize that the relationship between intrinsic religiosity and religious coping will vary by denomination. Evangelical Protestants will presumably report higher levels of positive religious coping in comparison to Roman Catholics. I believe this will be the case because, unlike evangelical Protestants, Roman Catholics have more requirements in order to reach salvation and be in good standing with their faith. Furthermore, evangelical Protestants practice more of a personal and private relationship with God. Protestants only have one source of authority, which is sacred scripture, whereas Roman Catholics not only have to engage in reading scripture, but also have an obligation to engage with church traditions like going to Mass every Sunday or getting their sacraments, such as a wedding. Because there's more requirements for salvation, I feel like they will be more likely to perceive something as punishment of God in not being able to reach the requirements that Catholicism requires. I'm also inspired by The Future of Illusion by Sigmund Freud. In this book, he states that religious ideas have arisen from the same need as all other achievements in civilization, from the necessity of defending oneself against the crushing superior forces of nature. In this quote, it is described that religion is a wish fulfillment. A faith without proof, it is meant and arose as a way for individuals to aid uncontrollable events. In other words, people feel that when they give part of themselves to a superior power, they're going to be able to control supernatural forces that humans don't generally have any control over. For personal motivations, I grew up Catholic, but I never fully believed in God because I learned a lot about the contradictions in the Bible. And while I may not be a practitioner, I do believe that religion serves a large purpose in society, and I believe that it's important as a framework to guide individuals' life to know right from wrong. And I want to study how religion can be used as a way to mediate against stress. So my question, once again, just as a refresher, is how does intrinsic religiosity shape coping strategies and interpretations of life stressors differently among evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics? This is important because it highlights how belief systems, religion as a social institution, which sociology focuses on, influences behaviors and examines sociological and psychological differences within Christianity. This is also important because negative life events can have negative health implications. So if we learn about the potential of religion as a coping resource, we can learn about ways to mitigate against the negative implications associated with life events. In particular, Peggy reveals that the more negative events that individuals experience in a given time period, the higher the likelihood they subsequently suffer an injury, an illness, a disability, or even death, noting that there are physical harms associated with stress. I believe this study is really important. So how is religion associated to stress? For some background, Perlin as seen as arising out of two broad circumstances, the occurrences of discrete events and the presence of relatively continuous problems. In other words, there are two sources of stress, which are life events, events that individuals don't really plan for and they're very disruptive, and chronic strains, which are events that require a continuous struggle to reach homeostasis. Religious ties into the stress process as a mediator, which Perlin defines as social support or coping. Learning about coping is important because it serves a very important function. Coping refers to the specific behaviors one takes to reduce the impact of stressors, and it has three functions. The modification of situations giving rise to the stressful problems, the modification of meaning of problems, and the management of stress. Religion is important because it can act as a coping resource, which can help do all these functions. There are multiple parts of the coping process in which religion can be involved. Argument who focused on religion more on a general note, not focusing on a specific type of denomination, found that religion can contribute to the coping process by shaping the characters of life events, the type of coping activities that individuals use, and the outcomes of the events. Religion can also be a product of coping shaped by other elements of the process. For instance, individuals who experience a negative life event may in turn reevaluate their religious beliefs. One framework that kind of explains how religion ties into the coping process is a meaning framework. This model suggests that to decrease stress, we must adjust our views of the events and revise our goals and beliefs of the world to accommodate the new information. The way to do this is to
Two meaning systems.
There's global meaning systems and appraised meanings of events. Religion acts as a global meaning system that guides individuals' understanding of the world and their place within it. So it shapes how individuals accommodate for new information and shape the casual attributions that individuals give to an event. So the initial response and meaning that people have and the reappraisal, which is meaning that people allocate to a situation after it has happened. So there are a couple ideas of Christianity for both Protestants and Roman Catholics that guide how it works as a global meaning system. In particular, some common ideas are of God's will, and it says that basically everything that happens in the world is something that God desires to occur as part of his plan and purpose for all things. There's also a lot of ideas of suffering and purpose, and this is just generally saying that we have a purpose to know and love God, to glorify him, to grow closer to him, to learn to repent, and to refine our faith. There's also a lot of moral values that Christianity offers that act as a way of guiding individuals in their stress process. And this is beliefs that one has to trust in God's plan, that we have to forgive, that individuals who practice this faith have a duty to serve others, and religion also acts as a global meaning system by outlining sin, so it tells you what you can and cannot do in order to reach salvation. So in my literature review, I found that religion, more generally, without focusing on a particular type of religion, can be tied to positive and negative coping patterns. For positive patterns, it is found that a lot of people engage in benevolent religious appraisals, saying that something is part of God's plan and God's will. Spiritual connections, so they might see a negative life event as an opportunity to grow closer to God and religious forgiveness. There's also negative patterns associated with using religion as a global meaning system. For instance, it can lead to spiritual discontent, punishing God reappraisals or reappraisals of God's powers in practicing with negative coping patterns. It's more generally believed that a situation arises from one disobeying God, and that may lead to them being harder on themselves. One example that kind of shows the power of religion as a coping source is in Bowman's and Wortman's study of 29 victims of spinal injuries. One of the respondents in his studies allocated his injury as a learning experience. He said, "It is a learning experience. I see God trying to put me in situations, help me learn about him and myself and others. Those who engage in this type of coping may see a negative event as something positive by using religion as a way to guide this new reappraisal." More about the statistical probabilities of people using it. A study of 485 individuals who experienced social distancing found that 73.3 respondents reported that religiosity and spirituality helped them cope with social distancing, and 7.3% experienced a spiritual growth as a result. This means that it is a common and frequently empirically grounded thing for individuals to use religion as a meaning system. So why study intrinsic religiosity in particular? It is proven to have been most strongly related to positive types of religious coping. In particular, Park found that religion is far more likely to be used in coping for those whom religion is highly salient aspect of their understanding of self and the world, and than with coping of those who are less devout. So the more devout you are, the more likely you are to use religious coping strategies. Given that I want to focus on differences within groups, I actually want to see those who think religion is important. Um, so I'm interested in the attachment theory, and this framework says that like a child's experiences a secure base provided by a primary caregiver, the attachment figure God may serve as a secure base for adult believers. So those with intrinsic religiosity are more likely to see religion as a primary and main motivator of their life, meaning they are more likely to have a stronger attachment to God. And this means that they're more likely to use religion as a secure base and something to rely on in a negative situation. So for the research gap, as you can notice from everything I discussed before, there's a lot of research discussing how religion can shape the stress process by serving as a coping resource that influences how individuals attribute and reframe life events, and that interest curiosity is more strongly linked to religious coping, but there's limited research comparing how this process differs across cultural and denominational contexts. For instance, the Park study did not really focus on a particular religion. It was just kind of religions that are monotheistic and believe in a God, not specifying in differences between denominations. So to address this gap and study how intrinsic religiosity influences the coping strategies and responses to life stressors differently among evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics. The study will use a comparative computer-assisted qualitative cross-sectional survey design. The study will use a sample of 200 American respondents over 18, ages 18, because at this point they're able to make an informed decision on whether or not they believe in God and the teachings of the Bible. And I want to have 100 evangelical Protestants and 100 Roman Catholics. I use 100 in each for each sample because I want a balanced representation so I can make a more reliable cross comparison. I'll also be using purposeful sampling because I want to specifically locate these groups. And even though it's not mentioned here, I also want to use snowball sampling in order to reach more individuals. The survey will be distributed across online platforms such as Facebook and Reddit threads. I chose this particular approach because it's not only cost effective, and it's so much easier for people to do at any point. It doesn't matter where they are physically, but also because these are places where individuals usually find themselves sharing their personal feelings. And most of the time it's anonymous. So for the study, I have three main variables. The independent variable, which will be held constant, is intrinsic religiosity. The dependent variable, which is what intrinsic religiosity will affect, is the religious coping strategies, so the type of appraisals that individuals give. And the moderating variable, will be the religious affiliation. So I will be focusing how evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics differ in this process. As for my control variables, I'll be controlling for race and gender. I've been controlling for gender because a study found that women are more likely to believe in a higher power. In a study comparing Dutch men and women, it is found that 60% of women compared to 40% of men believed in a higher power. I am also controlling for race because research points that engagement with religious coping differs across racial lines. The study found that when faced with health issues, African Americans and participants, while they may benefit equally from social support, regardless of their level of religiosity, Black individuals were more likely than white respondents to turn to religion during a health crisis. These findings conclude that if I don't control for race and gender, be unable to isolate the effects of interested religiosity alone, it might display the effects of race and gender rather than interested religiosity by itself. So for my first measure, to measure intrinsic religiosity, I'll be using Allport and Ross's intrinsic subscale of religious orientation. This composes 9 items in a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from 1 strongly agree to 5 strongly disagree. Individuals will be asked to rate the extent in which one agrees or resonates with a statement. And for example, one might be asked to scale from 1 to 5 if they read literature about their faith or church. And I use this as a measure because it focuses on how individuals interact and display intrinsic religiosity. So I want to see whether or not there are differences. On the other hand, to measure religious coping patterns, I'll be using Parliament's brief cope scale. It includes 14 items, 7 positive patterns, and 7 negative coping patterns. So it uses 2 different subscales, and it uses a 4-point Likert scale ranging from 1 not at all and 4 a great deal. Individuals may be asked to rate the extent in which they have looked for a stronger connection with God. And I use this particular scale because it distinguishes between positive and negative coping patterns on 2 different scales, which means I can analyze each one independently to see which one individuals are more likely to engage with. So for the format, the first part of this survey will begin with an informed consent page. This will outline the purpose of the study, the right to withdraw, and ensure individuals of confidentiality, ensuring them that there will be anonymous responses, names will not be asked, and this will address the ethics of the study. The second part will be addressing demographics. Individuals will be asked about their age, gender, ethnicity, and their religious affiliation, and this is done in order to contextualize the findings. The third part is the intrinsic orientation scale. This will measure how central religion is in each group and also how intrinsic religiosity is expressed differently between evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics. The fourth part is the brief R-COPE scale, which will be used to identify positive and negative coping patterns. As for the coding, a qualitative analysis involves converting raw data into statistics through numerical coding to allow for statistical comparisons of evangelical Protestants and Roman Catholics. Responses to a brief R-COPE and will be coded according to the respective Likert scale for single composite scores, 2 sample t-tests, and multiple regression analysis. And a cross-sectional design is especially important because it allows us to compare these groups at a single point of time. There are a couple limitations given that it is a cross-sectional design. I can't really measure how religious coping patterns between these groups differ across time. So whether it be like closer to the time that negative life event occurred or whether it be like different, like farther along the timeline, whether or not that affects how people engage with religious coping patterns, I can't really explain that through this study. Furthermore, given that it relies on self-reporting, the study is vulnerable to social desirability bias, and this is when people may answer to questions in a way that makes them appear more socially acceptable. And given that it uses an online format, it excludes individuals without any internet, or it may attract individuals who are more online, so like generally individuals that are younger. I expect that the findings will be consistent with the previous research of Park 2005 and Parliament 1998, which conclude that intrinsic religiosity is most strongly associated with the positive forms of religious coping. I hypothesize that the relationship between intrinsic religiosity and religious coping will vary across denominations. In particular, evangelical Protestants will presumably report higher levels of positive coping, which, according to Parliament's study, includes in spiritual connections in comparison to Roman Catholics.